This week, Koom talks with comics editor Chris Stevens, one of the founders of Locust Moon, a Philadelphia comic shop that became an indie publisher. Chris and Locust Moon co-founder Andrew Carl have edited 2 anthologies published by Dark Horse. Once Upon a Time Machine Volume 1 featured science fiction retellings of fairy tales, and in Volume 2 of the series, just released, ancient Greek gods are recast in tales of the far future. Chris and Koom talk about the work of Frank Miller, income inequality among comics creators, and of course the various stories in the Once Upon a Time Machine anthologies. First, I'd like to thank our patrons for keeping this show going. Join them at patreon.com/deconcomics. This is Tim in Tokyo, and this is Deconstructing Comics.
This is Koom for Deconstructing Comics, and I am talking to...
Chris Stevens.
In Brooklyn, I believe, right?
I'm in the Bronx.
You're in the Bronx, sorry about that. We met on the Frank Miller Facebook group.
We did, yeah.
Yeah, and we had a real fondness for Ronin, and then I think I disagreed with you about his Sin City stuff, and maybe we'll get to that later. But I find you to be a really interesting person. So I usually start off with asking people about where they grew up and how they got into comics. So did you grow up in Atlantic City?
I did, yes. I grew up in Atlantic City. I lived there till I moved to Philadelphia in 2008, so I lived in Atlantic City, most of my life up until my early 30s. I'm in my early 40s now, so I grew up in...
I figured we were about the same age because some of the influences you mentioned in other interviews are definitely of my time. So we are definitely about the same, which is amazing because you've had all this experience with running a comic book shop and publishing. But before we get to that, I think you said you kind of got into comics heavy about 8 or 9 years old, and I was a bit surprised about that because a lot of people I meet or I interview get into it like right off the bat. Like for me, it was like 4 years old. I can remember the first comic my dad properly bought me and how hooked I was by that.
Oh wow, yeah, no, that's awesome. See, yeah, I only have vague memories of Spider-Man and things of that nature. I guess the Justice League cartoon that was on in the late 70s, or but yeah, it's interesting you have such a formed memory from that young. I don't have those for like those years of 4, 5, 6, 7. They're more vague. I mean, I read comics, and I know Spider-Man was a huge thing in my childhood to me. I mean, I still love him, but that was kind of a cool thing back then, Spider-Man. But I don't have like really concrete memories until around 9, maybe 8, 9, somewhere in that area. And not to make this all about Frank Miller, but those would definitely harken back to his Daredevil, which was coming out around that time, and I guess maybe he'd done the bulk of it already by then because we're talking maybe 83, and I guess he came back and did the Weekend with Mazzucchelli. That was a little bit later, but his initial run was almost over by the time I got into it. But we had one little local shop that was like the proverbial hole in the wall in Atlantic City. And I just remember the older kids, I guess guys who would have been teenagers and seemed like adults back then, you know what I mean? I remember them talking about the Miller stuff and, the Daredevils being up on the wall for $5 or $10, which seemed like a, king's ransom back then. Miller was definitely, the Miller Daredevils are one of my earlier memories. And Captain Carrot, which is an odd couple, right? Frank Miller and Captain Carrot, but the DC did the Captain Carrot series, if you're familiar with that stuff. And,
oh, yeah, sure. I saw it around, and I like the art style. I never really got into the stories that much. It was kind of like the Marvel Tale stuff with Spider-Ham. It just never really, by the time it came into my hands. I grew up in England, so we were dependent upon what we could get, which was not always current with what you guys were getting. But by the time I moved over to Canada, then some of that stuff was floating around. And sorry, go on. Captain Carrot.
Oh, no, it's all good. When did you leave England for Canada?
Well, we didn't go directly to Canada. I left England about 86 with my family, and my dad got a job.
And you were born in Sri Lanka, if I remember?
Yeah, that's correct. I was born in Sri Lanka. My dad was studying in England. My mom joined him, then I joined him. And if I saw any comics in Sri Lanka, I don't remember them, but I do remember this Marvel reprint, this British reprint that was in black and white. We had Spidey and the Valkyrie that my dad bought when I was about 4 or 5, and I was just hooked. And so we went to
when
Peru.
You were a kid.
Sorry, go on.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I was going to say, when you were a kid, being that you were being that you were in England when you were a kid, did you come across? Because I think the years maybe sync up. Well, you would have been pretty young, but did you wind up coming across like the Alan Moore, Captain Britain stuff that Alan Davis drew? Is that anything that you saw when you were a little
No, that was kind of beyond me. Like, I hardly ever bought any of the UK mags, and comics were not really allowed. So even though my dad bought me that comic very early on, he was very much against my obsession with comics, and we didn't really have much money. So it was like whatever I could like borrow at school or from friends or whatever. And the UK used to have these like hardback annuals that would come out, usually with reprints, and they'd have annuals of lots of stuff, TV, music, comics, and I loved those annuals. And so some of those annuals, which had like reprints of comics from the 70s, let's say in the early 80s, it's just randomly what came into my hand. So there was this early Spider-Man annual, and it combined the 2 issues that were the death of Gwen Stacy and the death of the Green Goblin. And my dad didn't know any better, and I sort of guilted him into buying it because he never bought stuff for me. And I read that at a very young age, and it's a very powerful story if you're like, 7 years old. And so that was kind of, and that stuff kind of had its feelers. Kind of like there was a very kind of pre-awareness of there could be kind of heavier stuff in comics. But it wasn't until I came to Canada that I really discovered the Alan Moore and the Frank Miller. And those 2, which I think have struck chords with you as well, really, I would say, sort of galvanized my puberty because I was a very sheltered kid. And I remember reading the standalone second chapter of Born Again when I was in grade 7 here, which is my first year in Canada. My school library had some comics, and they had that issue, and I just took it home. And I didn't really know anything about Daredevil, and he's not in costume in that issue, and it's like the worst of that downward arc where he's like on the subway and he's like pummeling people into the glass. And
he's losing his mind and everything. Yeah,
and so I read that when I was in grade 7, and then I read The Killing Joke in grade 8 because I was so fascinated with The Killing Joke. And my dad was against comics, so I think I like stole some money from my parents, bought The Killing Joke, and then read it surreptitiously at night. I had to wake up in the middle of the night. We were living in an apartment because we were not well off, while my parents were asleep and my sister was asleep. And then I'd read The Killing Joke and other comics. And so at that age, those comics really kind of, I don't know, really affected me, but I couldn't really process them. And then it wasn't really towards the middle and the end of high school when I could get a part-time job and buy comics for myself that I kind of really discovered that Miller Daredevil run. So we're talking about like the early 90s now. And that just really... And then Alan Moore stuff, just a year or 2 after that just really kind of blew me away because I was sort of drifting away from comics because it just was too juvenile for me and limited and repetitive. And then I read that stuff. And I read in one of your interviews that you said Miller's stuff was kind of like a father figure to you. I don't know if it was that for me, but I definitely identified with Murdoch and all of the angst and the pain, especially in Born Again, and especially in some of the later Daredevils, where that really comes to a crystallization.
Yeah, I think I remember the interview you're talking about. I guess I sent you the link to that one, and with Miller, I think especially up until a certain age, I mean, I still have nothing but, reverence mostly for all of his work. I mean, even not to go down a rabbit hole here, but even something like Holy Terror, which, is much derided and story-wise and ideologically, I'm not that thrilled with it. But even in something like that, if you're just into the cartooning, there's pages in there where he does things that really only he could do. But that's me looking at it, at one age, growing up and reading him and him being sort of a steady, monthly influence in a sense. Growing up with his work in a way from his Daredevil run, on through say 300. Which I guess was late 90s, and I would have been in my mid-20s or something. And, there was definitely a father figure sense of, I always thought, I mentioned the Holy Terror up front just because I know that's like, younger generation or what Miller is considered right now, his reputation's a bit, it's a bit here or there for people. But, back then, for me especially, in all his work, what rang through to me was a very heroic sense of like a guy who wants to do right. Like Matt Murdock wanted to do right. The Sin City protagonists, especially say Dwight, or later on in the Helen Back storyline, I'm sort of spacing on the guy's name, but that protagonist, these are guys who want to do right. And I think Miller, that's what the work spoke to me. And I didn't see that in my in my day-to-day life when I was growing up. I was raised by my mom and grandmom, and there really wasn't a man in the picture. So, and it really, it's funny to think of as you get older, but Miller's definitely father figure is the best way I could put it,
Yeah. I mean, I think he does that thing where his characters are sort of like Western characters. They're flawed, but there's a kind of like a tender masculinity that's got depth to it. I just think like where that goes down.
That's a real nice way of putting it, what you just said there, tender masculinity. And
then when it's like Matt Murdock or even Batman and Dark Knight Returns, like if he didn't do the Daredevil stuff, I don't know if I would have found a way in through the Dark Knight Returns, even though it's a major milestone and all of that. But it's the Matt Murdock stuff that I think really balances out the other right wing stuff, because I think once he gets to Sin City, that's when it starts becoming crystallized, and it's much less complex, and it's much less interesting from that point of view. I think the first Sin City, he's sort of like playing with it and is still kind of ironic. But then after that, it's just like he really likes Dirty Harry. Like Dirty Harry's a character he comes back to. And, if you know film, you know that Dirty Harry is sort of like a modernization of a Western character, on the Western edge of civilization. So, but like he's a very right-wing character, and I like those Dirty Harry films as like cultural artifacts, but I don't find any identification with Dirty Harry. It's just they're kind of, they're works of art. You can do that kind of stuff in a work of art, but I mean, for me, like
if I found too much identification with Dirty Harry, we'd be in trouble.
That's right. Yeah,
but I think at the end of the day, even with a Dirty Harry figure, there's a guy who, I mean, sure, the term right wing probably does apply. I understand that, but I do think there's a thing, and with the Dirty Harry stuff, and definitely like an underlying thing in Miller's complete body of work for the most part, is a guy who wants things to be right, and it's not always easy or politic or proper to get them in that way. I mean, I always think of the Sin City, the 300 scene where Leonidas makes the trek up the mountain to talk to the oracles, and they're these filthy, dirty, basically like the politicians of our day today. I mean, they're just they're pretty lousy people who don't have their position based on any merit, yet they sort of set the tone. And they call the shots. And I think in Miller's work, he was always rebelling against that. And I guess as he got older, maybe it got a little more strident. And like I said, the Holy Terror thing is definitely something that sort of sticks in there. But just since we're talking about Miller, it's very exciting he's got all the slate of new releases that should come out in the next year. So hopefully he can balance out the last decade of his reputation with his new work. And I would just like to see him be appreciated for what he is and what he's done for comics, you know?
Well, I don't know if he can. Like, I think part of that has to do with his illness and the rumors of his drinking and so on. I don't know if his mind can go back to, I mean, it's... I think
he can, man. I think people are going to be surprised. I mean, I haven't seen the stuff, and I'm not, not trying to be coy or anything, but, there's people I know who've seen the stuff, and they seem to, I trust their opinion, and I think he's going to surprise people. I think hopefully he'll make us both happy, and a lot of other readers too,
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, I do agree with you largely. Like, I think, not just that sense of nobility that he has, but also the poetic, writing style that he mastered at a very early age, plus the innovations to comic book form, I think, and style are incredible. But I think his last great work is Give Me Liberty, and that's very much in the vein of what you're talking about, because it really satirizes the corruption and the kind of the stacked deck that people are living in, and it's I don't know. I mean, I'd really love to see Miller kind of return to that mid-'80s thing where he kind of didn't just need to work for DC and he could just do like odd independent stuff, like weird stuff, like he was doing with Dark Horse for a while before. Well,
not to cut off, but isn't if you saw the announcement, isn't him drawing the stories of the girl grows up to be the Lady of the Lake? That was just his announced project. I mean, that's pretty out there. That's a different project. That's not for DC.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, before we end up just talking about Miller and nothing else.
Yeah, fair enough.
I'll check it out. I mean, but yeah, no, I love Miller during the 80s. Like that thing for me, like I'll always read his stuff because of that, unless it's just so obviously offensive that I just feel icky.
This is what happens when you get two guys who, really love a creator who haven't talked much before. We're going about.
Well, we didn't even touch upon Ronin, which we both love, and I think I like Ronin more than Dark Knight personally because of that character embodies that nobility, but also it's when he's just bursting with all that Japanese influence and so on. And even though he's constructing that character, he's intelligent at that point in his career and his life to know that it is a construction because it's a projection of Billy's mind, the quadriplegic who projects this character, and it's a reflection of a media. It's a Japanese TV character that he's sort of like bouncing back. So like Miller's like quite complex. We've got a contributor called Paul Young on our podcast, and he's written a really good academic book on Miller's Daredevil that doesn't really read like an academic book. So if you have time, I would recommend it. He kind of looks at the politics of Miller's Daredevil, and it's a lot more complex than you'd think,
Yeah, no, I'll definitely keep an eye out for that. That sounds like something I would do.
Yeah, and he's as much influenced as we were, I think, or more so even. And anyway. So coming back
after this, maybe you can send me a link, but I'll definitely check it out.
I will do for sure. So coming back to you're about 8 or 9 and you're discovering Miller comics. Was it mostly like a sports culture you grew up in? Before that, like, what were you into?
Before 8 or 9?
Yeah, before you got into comics, before comics took a stronghold in your life.
I mean, to me, I've always like I said, I don't really have too many concrete memories from like ages 4 or 5. Like I don't know. I've thought about that sometimes. It's a whole different topic, but I think my memories really firmly start outside of some family stuff or holiday stuff or whatever. They don't really start in my mind the way so about 7, 8. So to me, comics have always been there. I mean, I like sports. I mean, I enjoyed sports when I was a kid, and I still like certain sports today. Comics were probably the main. The way I perceive my past, comics were always the sort of main thing. There weren't many kids, and I'm guessing it was the same for you. There weren't many kids in my elementary school, grade school, whatever you call it, who read comics. So I was sort of on my own in that regard. And maybe over the years you come across another guy or two who read them. And but I was always known for having the long boxes of comics and getting out to the comic shop off Atlantic City. These are islands, so when I say getting off the island, like getting off out of Atlantic City and to some of the the neighboring suburban areas that had nicer shops or whatever. That was sort of my thing since I was a little kid. So I mean comics to me would be the main thing that I was into when I was a kid and still today.
So in high school, did you know that you were going to work in comics? Was that a goal?
No, I mean, it was a goal. The only thing that I ever wanted to do, outside of I guess maybe not every kid, but I definitely had my silly period of, buying a guitar and hoping to be a rock star, whatever. But that was more of a passing, fancy, and I realized very quickly that I had no talent for it. Just a lot of love for guitar and certain music or whatever. So I think I wrote in high school and contributed. I didn't really graduate high school. I wound up sort of dropping out and getting a GED. It was sort of whatever teenage problems kids have. I had them, and I wasn't very good at school. I wasn't very good at school. So but when I think I finished sophomore year, and the Atlantic City High had a wonderful English creative writing teacher who I still keep in touch with to this day, Peter Murphy, and he ran there. And Peter's a recognized teacher and poet. I think he won some presidential medal, a few years ago. So he's a great guy, and he taught that class, creative writing, and I was freshman English student for him. And half the papers I wrote, I remember convincing him to let me write my papers on Watchmen or, Grant Morrison or whatever. So I always wanted to write comics. That was definitely the goal.
And you mean specifically write, not write and draw?
I have no talent for drawing. That would be a dream come true. My friend Farrell Dalrymple, who's fairly well known cartoonist and Vermont, only one of the great comic book creators working today, he told me in the past that it's really it's all just discipline. You just have to do it. And there's probably a ton of truth to that, but I also think there's talent involved, and I just didn't have any. So I was I never got into drawing them. Just wanted to write them, I never wanted to be an editor, which is sort of, that's definitely, at least, probably credits-wise, I've probably edited more books than I've written stories for at this point. But I just wanted to write comics. I never wanted to own a comic shop. That just happened. I never wanted to be an editor or a publisher when we were publishing through Locust Moon. Those were all great things, and I'm happy to have done them, but just writing comics was really always, sort of a boyhood dream turned into in my 20s, it was how the hell do I break through and get to do this? And it was, and finally, I guess I got published in my early 30s, and, since then been banging away at trying to make a go of it.
Okay, cool. So I guess we should skip ahead to you moving to Philly. I think you were working in a comic book shop, and then you opened your own? I moved to Philly. My wife was starting pharmacy school at Temple in Philadelphia, and we moved there, and it just happened. We wound up living on Locust Avenue, and when you say we, do you mean you were married at this point? And
I'm sorry. Me and my wife wound up, living on Locust Avenue, and just 2 blocks down the street, there was a video store that didn't really have any signage saying that it was the comic shop, but, it's a video store, which kind of dates this, right? This was 2008. So that, nowadays there are no video stores, but, this was the last gasp of that era. And I think it would have been like summer, fall of 2008 is when we moved. And yeah, I was just walking through the neighborhood getting acclimated, and I saw a video store, and I took a look, and in the back they had a comics section. And I was new to town, and she was going to school, and I needed to make some money, so I hit the guy up there for a job, and worked there for a couple months. I think I only worked there for 2 months, maybe, and it was clear that there was a really burgeoning comic book scene there. Like creators would come in and out, guys carrying portfolios, and it was, it's University City, like West Philadelphia. So the University of Penn is right there, Drexel's right there. There's a science school, a cooking school. It's very much a diverse neighborhood because it's just up against sort of like what you would consider almost ghetto-ish neighborhood thrown right in with University of Penn, which is, a $12 billion endowment type school or whatever. So it was a very diverse place, and there were a lot of creative types from all stripes of life around. And when I worked at this shop, it was pretty clear that, that shop wasn't a very good shop, and it wasn't very interested in being one. But I could see the potential, within those month or two that I worked there, I could see the potential for the neighborhood and what a good comic shop could be, ideally. And I met a guy named Josh O'Neill, who was just graduated from Penn and, was working there the same as I was, just trying to make a couple extra bucks here and there. And we sort of hit it off and came up with the idea, like, it doesn't look like this shop's going to be around too long because, the guy who owned it at the time really wasn't, interested in running it the proper way. And sure enough, he went out of business, and Josh and I were able to sort of sneak in there and open up what was the first version of Locust Moon Comics.
So
and we only lasted a year there.
So you used the same space.
We used the same space, yeah. We just rebranded it. We wound up calling it Locust Moon. There's no significance to that title. People, it's funny. People would walk in thinking it was a tattoo parlor or a Chinese takeout restaurant or something, and I happen to live on Locust Street, like I'm saying, and the store was on Locust Street and Locust Moon. I knew that I mentioned Farrell Dalrymple a few minutes ago, but Farrell's been, one of my earliest and best friends overall, but in comics especially, and I knew that he would do the logos for us. So I just figured, Locust Moon sounds like two good words that he could draw something cool out of. And, myself and Josh opened up the shop, and Andrew Paul, who is still my partner creatively, was never technically an owner of the shop, but definitely, a guiding force in helping us get everything off the ground and organized, and that carried through even more when we opened up the second iteration of the shop a couple years later. So yeah, going in the comic shop, man, it was fun. I miss it. I won't lie, I miss it. I think we had a lot of fun there, but it's a tough business.
Were you writing this whole time, or did the writing kind of take a backseat when you moved to Philly? I was, at the time, I was writing. I was writing probably, I'm writing again now, but for a while, let's say maybe the last couple of years, I wasn't writing as much. But when I got to Philly, I was actually writing. I had an agent. I've been published in a book called Postcards that a guy who's a good friend of mine, Jason Rodriguez. He's an editor and writer himself, and he had put this book together that Random House picked up. And that was back. It was a different time. It's 10 years ago, and back then, like the book market was sort of a booming thing, and like it wasn't discovered quite yet. 2007, 2008, and they were giving out great advances. And he got a great book deal, and me and him had been friendly just from like online stuff, and I think we had hung out for a weekend or so at SPX down in Maryland, and so I had done that, and that sort of led to me, because it was a Random House book, and it got like an Eisner nomination, and it got some attention. So that sort of led to me. I wound up working with an agent, and I was working on various things, and hearing nothing but good things about all the money I was going to make, and I never made that money, and I don't work with those agents. So
Yeah, so I was writing a lot. I had some series that were I was developing, that to this point either haven't quite come off the ground or just had to be abandoned. And I was also at that time was when I was initially developing what became Once Upon a Time Machine. So yeah, I was writing a lot at that time. And one of the things that really helped in terms of time and just to maximize everything was when Andrew came into the picture, because I sort of realized that he would be a much better, after knowing him for 6 months or so and getting, to know him a little closer, instead of him just having been a customer at the store where Josh and I had initially worked. Once I got to know Andrew, and he was doing some like minor sort of editorial stuff on some of the pitches I was getting, it just became clear very quickly that he would be a much better editor than I am or was. And so him coming into the picture sort of helped, launch into what became Once Upon a Time Machine.
Did you meet a lot of creators when you were working in the shop? Because you said there were a lot of people walking around with their portfolios and stuff. Did you build up a web of people? There were people coming in and out, but again, like I was new to town, and it wasn't you can use your intuition. A guy walks into a comic shop and he's got a portfolio, it's kind of like, I figure this guy's an artist, There were people coming in and out. But did you build contacts that way? Is that how you drew people into the publishing?
Once we opened the store, yes. The initial store that I worked at for that brief period, there wasn't so much of that. I think I met a guy named Jimmy Comey through that, and Jimmy is a great artist and does all kinds of work. He does murals for restaurants in New York City and Philadelphia, and he's a great cartoonist. I met him at that initial spot. Once he was about the only guy I can think of that really sticks as far as comic book people. Once Josh and I and Andrew opened the Locust Moon shop in that same location, yes, because we made a point to do a ton of events and stuff, as many as we could afford to do. So yeah, from there the local scene sort of realized we were, hopefully a cool shop and open to, creative stuff, and they started to come around. So yeah, at that point I would meet guys like, a Box Brown. Are you familiar with his stuff?
Yeah, I'm familiar with the name. I can't really think of his stuff or tell you if I've read any, but I've certainly heard of him. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, Box is great. He's a great cartoonist. He's done he did a bio on Andre the Giant, and he did a book about Tetris, and I think his newest book is on the life of Andy Kaufman. But he was a guy who early on did an event with us when we opened up our own shop, and and he was definitely tapped into sort of like the indie scene of Philadelphia. Philadelphia, like any town, is very cliquey, man. And we did our best. It always bothered me that it was cliquey, and I'd like to think we did our best to try to break down any barriers, but. I think any scene that you're involved in is cliquey, and Philadelphia was the same. But I think we did a pretty good job of drawing people. If I'm remembering the store from the early, maybe the first year, I know we did events with J.G. Jones, who lives in Philadelphia. Todd Klein came up. He lives in South Jersey, and he came up and did a thing with us.
Ed Piskor must have been around then, right? Because he's from Philly.
Ed Piskor?
Yeah.
I know. I definitely know Ed. I know Ed, and he did some stuff with us. He did several events with us when we opened the second Locust Moon, not the second location, but we had to close the first location. We were only open for a year at the first spot, and we just had a big falling out with the landlord and stuff like that. And we closed that, and then we opened up a new location. And when we opened that up, I've known Jim Rugg for a number of years and been friendly with Jim, and he sort of introduced me to Ed, and Ed definitely did stuff with us. But Ed is not from Philly. Ed is from Pittsburgh.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
Oh, no. I mean, like I said, he's still, we did some events with Ed, and we did what we call the Locust Moon Comics Festival. We did that 4 years running, I guess from 2012 to 2015. And we had a ton of great people. You know, we had Jim Steranko and Sienkiewicz and Paul Pope, and you know, a lot of great creators come through that. But Ed was we were lucky to have Ed for I think the first 2 years of that he came through. So yeah, no, I know Ed. He's just he's from Pittsburgh.
Cool. So you were saying that you found that you weren't so great at being an editor, and then Andrew stepped in. What did you find difficult about being an editor at Locust Moon Publishing?
You know, to be honest, maybe it's just a lack of. I think sometimes maybe I would have a lack of attention to detail. Like I look at it like a big puzzle. When you're making an anthology, at least, you know, like when you're making a book like Once Upon a Time Machine, the first one was 430 pages, I think, 432 pages.
Wow.
And the second one, the one that's going to come out, you know, in a couple weeks, I think it's April 11th, it comes out in comic shops.
Well, it will have come out by the time this podcast is up. It will have come out a few days before this podcast.
Okay, cool. So yeah, the second one that hopefully people, you know, if anyone, you know, who listens to this is interested, that'll be out and they can check that out. But that book is somewhere like, I think it's 248 pages.
Yeah.
So it's a shorter book, but that said, there's a lot of moving pieces. And I think hopefully if I'm good at any of it, I think that maybe I'm good at looking at the big picture and thinking, you know, like we have this, but we don't have that. Like we need to get that in there. And
right.
Andrew's also good at that, but he's very focused and he's very detail oriented. Also, he understands story. You know, he understands how to get to. He understands, maybe not. I shouldn't say he understands how to get there because he's working on his own writing. So I'm not saying like he's all knowing. But when it comes to editing someone's story, he understands that they're missing. Like every story should have A, B, and a C. You know, like beginning, middle, and an end for the most part. You can do some poetic type things that get around that maybe, but most stories should have that. And I've never, I'm very happy and lucky to work with him in the sense that I don't think I've never come across anyone who's better at like figuring out how to get those parts in line if they're missing and how to improve them if they're already there. So in that sense, yeah, he's the perfect partner for me.
Do you find it difficult to work with artists or writers in terms of getting them to meet deadlines or getting them to change their work if you feel things are missing or out of shape?
To answer the latter part of that, luckily we haven't had to go down that road, and I haven't had to go down that road too often of having people change things. I think a lot of the battle is fought before you even, it's won before you even fight it in the sense that you choose the right people, Mm-hmm. But yeah, we've had to do some things, and I don't think he'll mind me telling this story if he ever hears this. So I'll just tell the story where Dean Haspiel, a guy that I have great respect for in terms of how long he's been in the game and the stuff he's done, and and then I also know him as a friend and have a lot of affection for him. But not with Time Machine, but with the Little Nemo book that we did, Little Nemo Dreaming of a Dream. I had asked Dean to submit something, and he did, and it didn't work out. It did not work for what we were hoping to put into that book. And I had to go and tell Dean, look, this didn't work. Could you try something else? And he had finished the whole page. I mean, pencil, inked, colored, lettered, and I just had to say, no, I'm sorry, this one didn't work out. So, very uncomfortable to do, but I think if you do it, if it's coming from the heart and you're working with the right people, then it's not that bad of a thing. It's because you're trying to make the best. The one principle I think I hold to, and hopefully we held to with Locust Moon, and and Andrew and I hold to further as we go ahead making new books, is it's really not about anybody's ego or anybody's reputation or what they did before, or it's just about the best possible book, And if you stick to that, I think you'll wind up doing okay, and you won't hurt too many people's feelings if they know that that's the intention, So that's my experience with that. I'm sorry, what was the first part of the question?
I don't even remember anymore, but let's just go with that. So in that situation, Do you find it? Do you end up paying the person anyway because they produced a page, or how does it work? Is it purely a royalty system? Do you give advances? How do you deal with the economics of putting together an anthology with so many people?
Well, I will say that the reason that we folded Locust Moon and I'm no longer.
And now you're talking about the publishing, not the store.
Well, the store, yeah, I mean, they both closed. The store closed first because we just couldn't pay the rent. But the publishing end of things, we haven't announced it. It hasn't been, it's never really been talked about or made public or whatever. But yeah, I mean, Locust Moon has sort of gone off into the sunset. And the reason I say that is because the question you're asking, how do you deal with all that stuff? It's not fun, and it's tricky. It's you're making books that if you're lucky make a little bit of money and then have to be it's just the publishing end of things for us, and we were relatively successful. I mean, the Little Nemo book that we made, it did pretty well considering it was a $125 book. It made, like, on paper you look at it and it made a lot of money, and the artist got royalty checks and we made some money off it, so it wasn't the worst thing in the world. But that said, it's just not for me and Andrew, at least, it wasn't sustainable. My partner, our ex-partner, Josh O'Neill, who I mentioned earlier, who opened the first store with me, he's gone off and he's gotten involved, in his own publishing endeavor now called Beehive Books. And, hopefully it works out for him, and it seems like he's doing well so far.
Can you spell the name of his company? Yeah. How do you spell that?
Oh, sure. Beehive, Beehive.
Got it. And is he doing comics as well, or is he just doing other stuff?
He's doing comics, and from what I can tell, art books. He's sort of he's doing some good stuff. He's working with some great people. I know they put out a sort of artifact type book of a forgotten artist from the early part of the 20th century, Herbert Crowley, and now he's got some prose books, like taking public domain prose books and getting some of the best comic illustrators working to illustrate those books, and he's got some good stuff going. So he's got maybe more stomach for the publishing game than I did, and I don't want to speak for Andrew, but I guess I am. I guess he's got more stomach for it than either of us did, and
right.
I wish him a lot of luck with that.
So once the Locust Moon publishing arm was going, you got the Little Nemo book out, you put together the idea for Once Upon a Time Machine, and we should tell listeners what that is in a nutshell. And then
Sure.
You carried that to Dark Horse. And then, so at this point, would you say you're an editor for Dark Horse because you're no longer, the Locust Moon is no longer alive and kicking?
Well, I mean, I edit books. I guess, Andrew and I edit, the Once Upon a Time Machine series for Dark Horse. And, knock on wood, there'll be another volume coming out, and we'll be the editors of that. We own the material. So, Dark Horse is great to work with in the sense that they're pretty hands-off creatively, which, that's perfect for us because ideally I'd like to think we have most of our bases covered when it comes to the creative end, and to have someone step. We work with Randy Stradley at Dark Horse, and Randy has been, I might be messing this up a little, but if my memory is right, I'm pretty sure he was there with Mike Richardson when they, started Dark Horse.
Well, those are the two big names at Dark Horse, and I don't know if there was somebody else that founded it with them, but I think of them.
Well, I think a guy named Neil Hankerson was in there early, but Randy Stradley, I remember reading. I remember his name from the credits when I was 12 years old or whatever.
Yeah.
But no, Randy is our editor on Once Upon a Time Machine, and he gives us direction. When he thinks we need it, but for the most part, he keeps to himself and lets us. We pretty much deliver a book to them, and they have a good design team, and obviously they have a bookstore presence, and it worked out pretty good with the first book. So hopefully the second one, which is Greek themed, hopefully the second one has the same, sort of arc, and we get to do another one. Which
you should explain what they are, like in a nutshell, if you can.
Sure. So Once Upon a Time Machine, the first volume, was an all-ages anthology of sci-fi fairy tales and myths, legends, fables, from all around the world, given a sci-fi twist. So in the first book, it was wide open, like I just said, from all around the world, and you could have takes on, Little Red Riding Hood and classic sort of Hans Christian Andersen, Brothers Grimm material. And also there was an Indian myth in there, the Shepherd and the Weaver Girl. I think my story that I wrote for that first volume was actually a Japanese myth, so it was world myths. With the second book,
so do you think you wrote that story?
Well, for the first volume, I wrote a story called.
Yeah, because I don't think you have one in the new one, right?
Yeah, no, I do. It's just not that noticeable.
Oh, you did. Which one was it?
No, I'm kidding with you. In the second one, it's called "A Heavy Stone for All the Peoples." It's the play on the Sisyphus myth. Yeah,
I noticed that one. I guess I must have, they kind of blur a little in my mind, and I was trying to sort them out in categories of. Like, I felt like there were like 3 categories of how people approach the assignments. But in that one, the thing that just stuck in my mind the most was the fact that the art sort of seemed influenced by Paul Pope. And I could see influences on, because many of these artists are emerging artists, and I could see influences on them by like more famous creators. Did you kind of get a Paul Pope feeling from the art on your show?
Well, it's an interesting and very on point observation there. Dave Chisholm is the guy who drew that story, and at the time, I'm not going to digress too much here, but I was very much in a writing slump, and Dave's art and Dave's sort of camaraderie, and even though it's only 6 pages, I forget how long it is even. I think it was 6. Working with Dave really helped me get out of that slump. He was great. But and if anybody hears this and wants to check it out, Dave has a graphic novel out called Instrumental, which is sort of autobio. Dave's a great musician, and he also is a great artist, and people should check that out, called Instrumental. I think it was published by Z2 Comics. Who also, by the way, this all rounds back, did put out an edition of Paul Pope's Escape a couple years ago. But to speak directly to the influence, yes, I could see where Dave is definitely influenced by Paul. I think Paul has probably been the most influential artist on the generation of people who probably came up after him than anybody, to be honest. So,
sure.
So, I can name a million people who are either have developed their own voice now, or are developing it, or just doing their version of Paul, and are doing okay by doing it.
Yeah.
But yeah, no. And then when I said it was an astute observation, it's because when we were doing the pagination for the book and lining up how the stories were going to be ordered, we definitely, one of the earlier ideas, or maybe it was just my idea, but I thought my story. I thought it would go like at that point in the book. I thought there would be my story that I wrote, and then a pin-up, and then go into Paul's story. But Andrew,
because Andrew Paul Pope actually has a story in your new anthology as well. We should say that.
Oh yeah. Sorry, yes, I forget we're doing this for listeners. I apologize. Yes, Paul Pope did a short 2-page, really sweet, almost like harkening back to his teenage years take on the Iliad, and really cool stuff. I think he called it Heavy Iliad, or Metal. He called it Metal Iliad.
Metal Iliad.
Stuff. But yeah, when we were initially forming the pagination for the book, I had proposed that one sequence, and then Andrew, because that's he catches these things. He's like it's a good flow, but we can't do that because the artwork is a little, it almost, if someone's not paying attention, you would almost think one story flowed into the next, So
you're right.
It's cool that it's cool that you saw that, and I don't think that's embarrassing for Dave, because Paul is who he is, and I think it's a cool thing. But
no, I think it's kind of cool too, because like you and I are, let's be frank, we're not really young comic book readers anymore. And it's nice to see like a whole crop or a generation of artists who are influenced by people we know. They've loved them so much that they've sort of taken it to heart. Like there's the guy who did the Telemachus story, and I felt like there's no way you could not look at that and not see the Mike Mignola influence.
Oh God, yeah, Telemachus, yeah, which is sort of like it's one of the side stories of the Odyssey, I guess. Joe Delegata. Joe is a Boston-based artist. He hasn't done a ton in comics, and I really hope that he gets to.
Sure.
He's got a young daughter, and got to pay the bills, and I don't think he'd mind me saying, it's hard. Like, making money in comics is about as hard as it gets, in my experience at least. And there is almost no middle class. I know some guys who are like doing really well, and maybe what you would call rich or whatever. And then I know most of the people who are just poor, like dirt poor. Like, sure. I don't know too many in the middle, is what I'm saying. And
and the thing about comics, which I find kind of interesting, is that even people who are doing well, like, I don't know, say Neil Adams, who is sort of like at the height, the pinnacle of comics illustration success, at one point in the industry, they're, buttressing their pay by doing a lot of signings and a lot of commissions and a lot of sketches.
Specifically with Neil Adams, think about it too, where he's a living legend, and rightfully so. And then also think, yes, he does his signings and he charges for signatures, so that, like you say, that's a way of buttressing his income. And also he's got continuity, which has been a fairly not major, I would say. I mean, I don't know that world incredibly well or much at all, to be honest, but I know, continuity is an advertising firm, basically. They do ad work. Mm-hmm. And he's had that since the 70s, Right. So I'm assuming, he's got Manhattan offices, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure he does. I'm sure the bulk of his income is through that, you're right. Even someone like Neil Adams, I mean,
when I saw him in person, he visited the Toronto Comic Shop, and nothing against him. I mean, there's been many stories said about him and whatever, but just when I saw him,
I could share some of those off the record, man. I got some.
Sure. But it just seemed kind of sad. I mean, to see him, like, I'm not saying
he chooses to be there, though. So.
No, I know, but I'm not saying that is sad. I'm just saying the experience, and I'm not saying this to be mean, but he's very overweight. He wasn't really dressed well. He was sort of dressed sloppily, kind of like that detective in Batman comics in the 80s.
You're thinking of Harvey Bullock.
Yeah, I'm thinking Bullock. He was kind of like, it's kind of sloppy, and he couldn't really move very well. And then I think it was his wife who was with him. He was ordering his wife around to put all of his illustrations up on the walls and stuff, or display tables.
I think his wife and his daughter pretty much help him man his operation. I know his daughter Chris handles his. Like if you're trying to get him to do work or whatever.
But it wasn't pleasant, is what I'm trying to say.
Oh, that's a shame. No, that's a shame that's like that's a shame that's the takeaway from it. I will say this in his defense, and like I said, I mean, if this was a different kind of, like when we just talk privately, I could tell you, and nothing like, not that he's a monster or anything, but he's a hard guy to try to work with. I will say that.
He's got that.
I will say publicly.
He's got that reputation. Yeah.
I've tried to work with him. We tried to work with him at Locust Moon, and we had agreements and arrangements, and it turned into, nothing got done, put it that way.
Yeah.
But that said,
but I could tell you that just from my interaction with him, where I got a book signed by him. Like that just comes across, and it's
what's funny?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, what's funny? In person, when I proposed these things that we were hoping to do together, when I proposed them to him, they were proposed in person, and he was great. I thought he was very humble, and he was actually almost sweet. He was a nice guy. I mean, I thought he was fun. And just to go back to like the weight and everything, I guess, but man, he's got to think too. I think he's like 76 years old. Yeah. Man. I think he looks great for his age. You know,
yeah.
I think I wish I had his head of hair. I'll tell you that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it might not be totally natural, Chris. You know, money can buy a lot these days.
Coming up, more about Once Upon a Time Machine, why Marvel editors have an advantage over most other comics editors, and more. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting this show every week. We really appreciate your support.
This is an imaginary podcast, which may never have happened.
The Shortbox Showcase.
But then again may have. About a father and daughter. I'm Professor Allen.
And I'm Emily.
Who came from Ohio and talked about comics.
Walking Dead.
Tintin.
Black Lightning.
White Tiger. It tells of their rise to glory, when the great guests were yet to be booked.
Let's put it this way, Shogun Warriors wasn't going to win any Eisners.
And the great feats of editing not yet performed.
This is Ultra 7, this is Ultraman Jack, and this Ultraman Taro, and this Ultraman Leo, and this
of how they spoke at length.
This continuity is really the brainchild of nitpicking nerds the world over.
But to be fair, the best kind of confession is the Force confession.
And reviewed in brief tales that explore creatively the bounds of a given character's history.
Red Sun is wonderful with a very strange ending.
Of brilliant creators before their fall from grace. This is the era where Miller is at the height of his creative and artistic powers, and the ability of strong writing to encapsulate and transcend its time.
Flash of Two Earths by Gardner Fox.
This is an imaginary podcast. Aren't they all? Shortbox Showcase is part of the Relatively Geeky family of podcasts. Check us out on the web at relativelygeekypodcast.blogspot.com or search in iTunes for Relatively Geeky or Shortbox Showcase. And remember, we're not experts.
We're just family.
But we should go back to Once Upon a Time Machine Volume 2, which will be out by the time this podcast is up. Were there any particular artists or writers that you worked with, any of those chapters that you really want to talk about that really kind of meant a lot to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's always tricky, you know, like the first rule of these kind of things when you're doing talk about an
you don't want to pick favorites, which is why I was trying to word it in a non-favorite.
No, you know what? I'll break the norm and pick favorites.
All right. I love it.
I think, and you know, anyone who knows me or knows anything of like, you know, what we do or what we did at Locust Moon, and just in this talk, it's established that, you know, Andrew Carl's a close friend of mine, and, you know, we work together pretty much on a daily basis. You know, we're on the phone, you know, talking about things or trying to work on things. So yes, that said, him being my friend, I think his story Icarus that he wrote, and Gideon Kendall, a New York-based cartoonist, illustrated. I think that story is a favorite of mine, and I think it's nearly like if we were doing open solicitations for a book, and like the goal was to take an old fable and transform it into what the Once Upon a Time Machine books are, you know, the sci-fi twist on a classic story. I think Andrew's Icarus is probably the perfect example of how to do it. I mean, I've looked at it a lot, and we looked at it a lot as it was being formed. You know, pages were cut, pages that were wordless had words added to them. There was a lot of, you know, even though it's a short story, there was a lot of like care and finesse that went into it. Gideon was super accommodating, and he nailed it on his part. And I just think it doesn't really get any better for me as an exercise in how do you take this old thing and make it new. I think he killed it on that. So that's definitely a favorite.
Yeah, I that was one of the standout ones for me too. That's one of the ones that stayed with me. The timing was very good on it. The storytelling was good. I love the premise. Can I talk about the premise, or would that be a spoiler?
No. I mean, hopefully people will hear this and get interested.
So the nugget of this particular story, so for this volume, it's all Greek myths, and they've been reinterpreted in a sci-fi context. So there's a father and son team, kind of like Icarus and Daedalus, and they're going back in time in a spaceship that's effectively a time machine, and they're making records. And then the Icarus character, the son, kind of doesn't heed his father's warning not to go too far back in time, and then kind of steals off while his father's asleep, and he wants to witness the Big Bang. And so he goes back too far in time, and then he sees the birth of the universe. And then I'm not quite sure what ends up happening. I don't know if he gets taken apart at the end, or there's a sort of like an echo of an Alan Moore kind of thing in the idea. And then when you see him taken apart, it's kind of like, Dr. Manhattan taken apart, or Swamp Thing taken apart, or Marvel Man taken apart, or any of those characters taken apart, kind of by their own transcending of human limitations. But I mean, the nitpicker in me goes, well, if he goes back to witness, the Big Bang, how is that possible? How could he stand outside it? Because time and space both come out of the Big Bang. So if the universe doesn't exist as a space that you can, inhabit and fly around in or walk around in, how could he witness the Big Bang as separate from himself?
I understand that, and I totally I see your take on it. I think for me, when I read it, it's funny because one thing we've never discussed is like the point of the story. As much as Andrew and I speak, and as much as we talked about this book, I never touched on about the point of the story, because to me, I think for me, the way I take it is that like I understand what you mean, like scientifically about the Big Bang and the technical aspects of what would really be. To me, it's like the kid went too far, and he's in the void now. Like he's gone basically. Right. To me, that's how I look at it. You're right on the technical aspects, I'm sure, but for me, it's the kid. He went too far, and just like Icarus fell back into the ocean or whatever. He didn't fall in an ocean. He fell into time, so to speak. But I don't look at it like he's out there drifting, or this is just my take on it. I don't look at it like he's out there drifting.
I think Andrew did a good job, and like what's really commendable is he takes the nugget of something that we know, and he transposes it very well into a sci-fi context. I don't think some of the other writers do that so well, if you want my honest opinion.
All I'm interested in is your honest opinion.
Yeah. Some of them are kind of, there's just sort of a very basic reference point to the original myth. And I'm not dogmatic. Like, I don't think it has to kind of, ascribe to the paradigm of the original myth, but sometimes it's just, I feel like it's maybe a manga-esque story or something with just kind of a nod towards it by like having the characters named the same, or like there's a gang fight or whatever. Like I really like the Mike Barron one, which was kind of a kung fu kind of take on Pegasus style fighting.
I'm sorry, you liked it or you didn't like it?
I liked that one, but then there was another one with like a Jason and the Argonauts kind of thing where, it was just kind of a name that was kind of, I think, attached to the story. Like the story itself and the writing didn't really evoke Greek mythology or really Jason and the Argonauts or much for me.
Yeah. Those are two interesting examples. Do we have time? Do you mind if I give you a little nugget on each of those stories?
Yeah, no, that's what I'm trying to do. Is I'm trying to get info from you about the nitty gritty of putting the book together. So please do, yeah.
Sure. With Mike Barron, Mike was in the first book. We really not, I know the focus is on the second book here, but the first book was almost all unknown talent, and we were totally unknown. By the time we start the second book, we knew that the Little Nemo book was, we were gathering a lot of steam on that, and we wound up doing well with that. We won some Eisner Awards and worked with a lot of amazing people. So there was a lot of pressure to make this second Time Machine, better than the first. And I was definitely interested in working with some writers who, I like working with new people and it's fun. But with this one, I was hoping to work with a couple of established writers, and Mike was sort of on my mind because I love Nexus so much. The Nexus book that he did with Steve Rude and mostly in the 80s and 90s, but still comes out here and there. So yeah, getting Mike involved, and Mike was super amiable and on board from the beginning. And then he had the idea of doing like a pretty, very, on the surface, the story is very simple. It's very simple and stripped down, and Pegasus and some martial arts. And if you remember the company CrossGen, Koom, you remember them? I mean, they came and went, but
it rings a vague bell, but I don't think I ever read any of their stuff.
They were actually a sort of big player for a couple years in the early 2000s, I want to say, and they wound up developing and sort of launching the careers of a lot of great artists. I mean, I think Jimmy Chung and Josh Middleton and what's his name, Andre DeVito. Lots of great artists came out of there. But one of the favorite books, one of the only books, honestly, that I really remember and was my favorite book that they put out at the time was called The Way of the Rat. And Jeff Johnson was the guy who drew The Way of the Rat. So The Way of the Rat was like a talking monkey, martial arts, dragons, and all that kind of shit running around type book. So when Mike Barron turned in the script for his story, it was like, wow, like, imagine if Jeff Johnson drew this. And luckily we were able to get Jeff Johnson to draw it, which was a real fun. That doesn't happen too often when like you have an idea and then you think, oh, this would be the perfect guy to draw this. It doesn't matter if the intention of the work is Watchmen or if it's just like a gag comic or whatever. Whatever your intention is, that's hard to pull off. So it was real fun for me to see Jeff come on board and do the work he did on Barron's thing. That's like one story. With the Argonauts story, and I know the one you're talking about with the Jason and the Argonauts take, if there's any fault on that story, and it's interesting, I appreciate hearing your negative opinions as much as the good ones, trust me, because that's how you get better at stuff. But just so you know, and if anyone who reads the book and hears this, I have to take the blame for that one, because that was initially a script that I was writing, and I wrote like the page breakdowns, very rough page breakdowns, and I had the outline and I had the gist of it, but just circumstances in my personal life, I couldn't bear down and bite down and finish the actual script. And my friend Tara Alexander, who wrote that script, she was nice enough to step in at the last minute and take over on that. So if there's any flaws in there, I don't really think they're on her. I think she took a format and she made it her own. And, sorry that one didn't work for you.
No, that's okay, but maybe that's also why, because it wasn't hers to begin with, and sometimes when you take over somebody else's thing that's not really your own style or whatever, it kind of comes out as a bit of forgive me for saying this, an aborted kind of project or an idea or something. I mean,
if you want to get a better sense of Tara's stuff, I know she's working on other stuff right now, but as far as published stuff, I know that I think her story. She wrote a story for Once Upon a Time Machine Volume 1. I'll try to get you a copy of that too. I wish I thought to do that before this, but I'll try to get you a physical copy. I'll send you one.
Sure.
And she wrote a story in there that was all her. And it's one of the best stories in the book. So yeah, if there's any flaws in the Argonauts thing, I sort of have to take blame for those.
I don't mean to put you on the spot either in terms of justifying or defending the book.
That was the point of it.
But on the other hand, I did really like the stuff that just went off the deep end. Like, for example, There was the Metro Taurus one where, once again, it was sort of in a Paul Pope kind of style, kind of. So maybe that artist was part of that generation you were talking about that was influenced by Pope. But where the guys on the subway, you know?
Yeah. That's Ron Wheaton.
And it was just so different that I liked it. And also the other one that sticks out for me that's so different, besides the pinups are great. I think sometimes the pinups are just the best. They're just like a refreshing thing. But the other one that really sticks out is the Gaia and the Uranus thing, where it's the seed of the idea is there, where you have, you know, the Earth nourishing people, and then you have Uranus like raining down on them and like destroying them. But it's so sci-fi. It's so much different. It's about terraforming, and it's a little tongue-in-cheek, and it's satirical, and it's postmodern. So that sticks out in my mind. So those are ones I really liked.
That's. I mean, there's a funny little anecdote behind that one. That's a guy named Jonathan Toon, who did the Uranus story. I think he called it cosmology.
Yes, I think so.
I shouldn't be guessing, sorry. But yeah, I think it was cosmology, and it was, you know, his take on Uranus, and how I came to know Jonathan, how he came to be included in the stuff we do. He was actually, he had a page in the Little Nemo book as well. His girlfriend came into the Locust Moon comic shop one afternoon and just said to me, "Oh, hey, like we see online that you guys are doing this Little Nemo book, and you know, my boyfriend's an artist, and not to be a jerk, but I mean, you know, you hear that stuff so often, you know, like everyone's a writer and everyone's a great artist, and you kind of tune out to it at a certain point." But she turned out to be right, and you know, Jonathan, once I saw his stuff, he was really good, and her name, Eleanor, Ellie Dowdy, she actually colored, I don't think she colored the Time Machine thing, but she colored his Nemo thing, and she's a great artist in her own right. But yeah, that was a funny little like happenstance of that. Like, how do you meet people? Or when you were asking me earlier, how do you like build a team or put things together? That was just, Jonathan Toon's come to be someone I work with because his girlfriend came into the Locust Moon shop because she had seen, they were from Virginia at the time, I think, and she had read some good reviews of our store, or we did events with certain artists they liked or whatever, and you know, then we, you know, winds up culminating and getting the chance to work with the talented creators like them, and they're both very young. Jonathan's young too, so I think he's got a chance to do some really cool stuff in comics if that's, you know, the path he goes down. I'm glad you like that one. It's a tricky story, you know. I won't lie to you. I was joking with Andrew before. Yesterday, before, you know, knowing me and you were going to get on the phone today, I was joking, like sort of joking, but sort of being serious. It's like, I guess I got to read that one story again so I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's hard when you got so many. Like even for me, like I had to read it in pieces, and this one was the shorter anthology, like at only 200 and something pages, and then. How do you talk about, like, even the best anthologies, like some of my favorite anthologies, like when I was young, do you remember Dark Horse's, sorry, my mistake, Fantagraphics, Best Comics of the Decade, Volume 1 and 2? And then they had, like, other anthologies like that at the end of the 80s.
Oh, yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, those ones that sort of really kind of blew my mind and opened me up to some of those alternative creators that I didn't know about. I mean, if you were to review them, like it's hard to know how to like talk about it as a whole because it's. But I wanted to ask you. So since the success of the Nemo book or the first Time Machine book, how do you find interacting with the comics community, whether you go to a convention or your ability to, because you talked about how it could be cliquey, and I agree with you. Comics can be cliquey, but it can also be very friendly too. Like, you know, that's sort of how you and I connected. But did you find that people accepted you? Did you find that it was possible to get those opportunities? There was a time when they were saying that comics and graphic novels, at least a few years ago, I heard this, were the only things really selling in bookstores. So were you able to kind of find your way into the success of that whole scene, both socially and economically?
Well, Economically, to be honest, no. If it was successful economically, that we'd probably still be a unit as Locust Moon, Press, which was the publishing end. It wasn't like very. I mean, for yes, the Nemo book we made some money off of. Like, let's say I was able to live, a very modest lifestyle. Also keeping in mind that my wife is, she wasn't a doctor then, but she was working as a pharmacist, and she was making, she wasn't able to work often because she was also in med school, but she worked 2 days a week, and she probably made $500 a day, which, I think is good money to most people. It's great money to me. So
absolutely.
Oh, yeah, sure.
That's way more than I make, that's for sure, yeah.
Oh, trust me, I'd be happy to make that. I'd be thrilled to make that in a week. But that said, I'm only bringing that up to say that economically, I had that, to help me. And with the success of Nemo, I probably lived like a year off of Nemo, maybe, let's say. But again, I'm bringing up my wife working to show that it wasn't like I couldn't have lived a normal life off that. It was my wife also making money and living a pretty modest lifestyle. So economically, no. Creatively, it's yeah. I mean, it's always better to have something under your belt than to not. I mean, a lot of the creators I'm friends with, or people that I work with on a sort of regular basis, in the sense that projects tend to come out, every few years, so as regular as it can be. It's I don't know how much. I don't think the relationships were made through the success, if that makes sense. I think the relationships were pretty much there, and then it's easier to meet people. Sure, it's easier to meet people if you have a published book, and if I reach out to an artist nowadays who I don't know, and I'm just reaching out cold, and I like their stuff and think maybe we could do something cool together. Yeah, I mean, it's easier to say, oh, hey, I did this book that won the Eisner Award, but does the Eisner Award translate into money? I can tell you for a fact it does not. It does not. Not at all.
And you don't find that suddenly the comics community has opened their arms to you because you've got an Eisner? I'm not talking about professionally when you contact somebody about doing a story. I just mean if you go to a con or people reaching out to you. Fandom or the industry? I guess I was asking more about the industry as an opportunity being created and doors being opened.
Well, I'll tell you this, and I think this is a good little nugget for what you're trying to get at. Are you familiar? Honestly, I've never seen a print copy of it, but I know it exists. I've seen some of it online. Are you familiar? I guess Image, the publisher Image, I guess they do something called Image Plus, which is like their magazine about their company. You familiar with that at all?
No, not at all. Sorry.
I think it's a monthly thing, and it's like a $5 oversized magazine about Image the publisher, and spotlights on the creators and snippets from various series and that sort of thing. Well, last year they were openly advertising that they needed an editor, an assistant editor, I think it was. And I had just moved to the Bronx. Philly was sort of I'd been in Philly for 8 years or so, and that's sort of what I was knowing. And I was just in a bind financially where my mom was getting really sick. She's passed on since, and this was the crunch of her getting really sick, and just a lot of stress, and more money would have made things easier to just, sum it up. And I saw they were hiring. I sent them the thing saying hey, they didn't even get back to me. And that's Image Plus. I don't think that's, that's not the heights of the industry. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And I sent them my thing saying, hey, I founded this company, and, I have a series of Dark Horse, and I won these Eisner Awards for this book and the Harvey Award for this. And here's my thing. And I'm pretty sure what I sent them was, well written and properly intended. And it didn't even get me a reply from whoever was in charge of that. So, so no, I don't really think it opened any doors, I'd love to say it did. I would love to say it did, but I don't want someone to hear this, or, I know that I come across some younger people, who are like maybe in their 20s or whatever, and through Facebook mostly or whatever, and they think like, oh, it must be easy street, and it's very, very far from that, and creators far more experienced and successful and viable, than I would be, to tell you the same.
Sure.
It's a tricky way to make money, man.
Yeah, I don't think the perception is so much that it's easy street, because it's a lot of work, especially if you're an artist, because you're constantly hunched over the drawing board or the computer.
But that's a whole different world. Being the artist is a whole different world, and those guys, from my end of things, being a writer, hoping those guys will bring my words to life, or being the editor, publisher, whatever role, there's always going to be a bit of antagonism in the relationship.
Sure.
You're like any relationship, you're trying to get something, like it's just how it works. And but
it's also a management worker relationship, right? So it's got a kind of Marxist aspect to it. You can't avoid it, no matter how much you're friends with the people.
You can avoid it, and it's extremely. It can get. It doesn't always. Sometimes it doesn't come up at all, but there are occasions where it can get choppy. In that, like you just said, it's a very Marxist sort of. At the end of the day, you can get, and I've had this happen with guys who are my best friends, like where they start to see you as the boss and they resent it, Mm-hmm. And I think that the big editors, I think editors is like, and when I say big editors, geez, I don't want to sound like I'm slighting people, but the guys who edit books for Marvel or DC, I guess they're big editors or whatever. You can look at the books and draw your own conclusions to what the results are, and I don't want to put anyone down, but I think those guys get over. I think it's a little easier to be them in a sense, because you fall back on the paycheck. Like in other words, if you have a problem with an editor at Marvel, you're still getting that Marvel page rate if you're the creator, and that Marvel page rate, is probably one of the best, if not the best, in the business. Plus, you're getting the chance to work on the character that probably was your childhood dream or whatever. So I think those editors have it a little bit different than an editor, say like myself or Andrew or Josh doing his thing with Beehive, where we have to deal with people just on a one-to-one basis, and you have to be real and you just have to be true. And it works usually, but yeah, feathers get ruffled. All the time. Feathers get ruffled. Somebody thinks they're not getting treated as well, or you're able to pay someone, but you can't pay everyone. And if you're looking at that in a vacuum, it sounds shitty. But the truth is, think about making a movie. A movie needs 50 actors. But if you have Leonardo DiCaprio, right? You can get your movie made because you have Leonardo DiCaprio, and maybe everyone else gets peanuts practically, but you still get your movie made. It's very similar to at least my experience in trying to make anthologies in particular, not other things. Other books are different, But anthologies, which is what Once Upon a Time Machine is, that it's tricky.
Well, do you end up? Is the system geared so that you end up not paying some people at all? Do some of the people who contribute their work get nothing in terms of an advance or royalty or any base amount?
Well, it varies from project to project. Specifically Once Upon a Time Machine, are you asking? Or?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, the advance that we get, I mentioned earlier how Dark Horse is wonderful to work with creatively, and Randy, is a great sort of shepherd for what we do and lets us do what we do. But there's a price you pay for that as well, I think, and that is that the advance, the money that we were given to make the book, we've done this twice now with Time Machine, and both times we've put in more or equal of our own money to the advance to be able to make a book that hopefully is, a worthwhile book. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and you're just hoping to break even, I guess.
Yeah, I'd never
maybe make a little bit. I don't know.
We might have made a little bit off the first one if you look at it all, but I'm not even sure. Andrew, he keeps a closer record of that stuff. With this one, before the book even comes out, I'm not going to get totally into the numbers, but we're well out of pocket. And that's because Dark Horse gives you a number and says, do you want to make the book? And you can either make the book or you can bitch and, complain and not make a book. So we make the book. And, luckily, we have this network of really amazing people. Like, if we ever made a book with, you mentioned the Metro Tourist story, Ron Wimberly. I mean, Ron probably pays his rent. I don't want to speak for Ron, but I'm guessing he pays his rent mostly doing, like, Nike advertising stuff. And he's a comic book creator. I mean, he's got Sunset Park, and I think he's calling it Slave Punk. He's got series coming out from Image, and he's got a lot going on. But I'm guessing the bills get paid by more commercial stuff. So if we ever tried to make a book with Ron or like Paul Pope, or if Mike Barron wanted his real page rate or whatever, like, we could probably never do any of that.
Right. I hear you.
So we're lucky that we've developed a network of friends who are creative. Yeah, they have confidence that we're going to, develop it and deliver a good product. We're not going to take what they give us and do anything to lessen it or bastardize it or anything. We're going to treat it the way it should be. But yeah, I mean, I guess to really answer your question, yeah, there's people who probably don't get paid anything. It's just, I don't make any money off it, so it's tricky. I wish everyone made money. I wish I made money. But you. In a lot of ways, and I think this is good for any aspiring people out there who want to do this to hear, you can choose. You can make your money and never publish anything and think about the money you should have made, or you can make the book and hopefully it makes you a couple bucks, or it at least gives you entree into that world. And a published Dark Horse book is a lot better than sitting there with shit in your folders, like just looking at stuff on, so.
Well, that's the way I feel, too. I mean, about my writing, or even what I'm doing right now with you. I'm not making money off of it, but it enriches my life. And I'm glad I did something with my time at the end of the day. It shouldn't be that way, but it is, and that's all right, I think.
Yeah, but do you agree with me, too? Like, you doing what you're doing, like, I understand you're taking a chunk out of your day, a couple hours here to do this talk, let alone the fact that we've had various exchanges that have taken your time leading up to this. But at the end of the day, I mean, it might not happen. Maybe it won't happen. But who knows? Like, all this is preparation for you to do something else. That's how I look at it. Like,
I don't even think of it as preparation. I think this is the thing. This is me having quality of life. And,
that's how I look at comics, Yeah.
I mean, talking about Frank Miller and talking about what you're doing and so on is the joy, on the weekend at the end of my week, at the end of my work week. But you were saying that you were struggling with bills right now, so I did want to ask you about that before our time's up. I was kind of interested in what's going on now and, where you're at with everything and what your challenges are right now.
Well, creatively, I'm focused on, this book will come out in a couple of weeks, and right now I'm just trying to set up, Andrew is out in San Francisco, so we're on the opposite coast right now, and he's trying to set up, events and signings and whatnot, if we can do things, since Once Upon a Time Machine is an all-ages project, ideally we'd like to do things, that involve, younger kids and grade school kids. That's sort of the target of this audience. I mean, ideally anyone can read the book and enjoy it, but I mean, we definitely make it, thinking there's a reason it's all ages. We want kids to enjoy it, and we want parents. One of the great things about the first book, and we were able to go and do a lot of cons and sort of go on the convention season tour for a couple of years, and the reaction of kids with their parents and just parents to the First Time Machine was a really great reaction. And hopefully we can rekindle that with the second one. So right now, personally, I'm planning, some stuff in New York, hopefully, and get guys like Ron Wimberly, who did the Metro Tourist story that you like. Paul Pope is in New York. So, hopefully we can get out and do some signings for that. And I'll go back to Philly, do a signing or two there. The guy we haven't brought up, Michael Swanwick, Michael is an author who wrote the story that you liked, the guy that you said reminded you of Mike Mignola.
Mm-hmm.
Michael is actually, like, very decorated science fiction novelist. I think he's won, in fact, I know he's won, I just don't want to quote the number. I want to say 7, but that number might be off. But he's won more Hugo Awards than any living writer. And it was it's a
great story, by the way, and I like the art too, although I could not stop thinking about Mike Mignola, even in the color of the story. But the story is great. I mean, it's one of the ones that is memorable and stood out for me.
I'll tell you, that was one of my great pleasures. Maybe my greatest pleasure. As you know, circling back to an hour ago when you're asking me about drawing or whatever, like I can't draw. So, you know, it's like always the thing you can't do that you sort of envy. You know what I mean, Koom? Mm-hmm. You know? So not being able to draw, having Joe come on and do the job he did over Michael's script was just, because when I read Michael's script was probably the best script I've ever read for something that I've been involved with. Mm-hmm. It was just a different thing. And I knew he was, you know, I had met him through a mutual friend. It's funny how small the comics world is. I met Michael at a one-man play being put on of Dracula that took place at a guy named Kyle Cassidy's house in Philly when I was there. And Kyle is a photographer, and he writes books, but he's more well known as a photographer. And Kyle, you know, he's a photographer like Neil Gaiman and George Martin and all these people. Like he's super tapped into like the sci-fi fantasy world. And he just introduced me and said, "Hey, Chris, this is Michael Swanwick." And I was like, "Oh, cool." And so like the path to getting Michael to come on and do that story and deliver the script. He did the very first comic script he ever wrote, and he killed it. And I'm glad you liked that one. And you know, so that would be a particular pleasure. But yeah, for me, since I'm focused on like sort of right now, Koom, I'm sort of like the publishing stuff is done. We'll hopefully do another one of these with Dark Horse, and you know, maybe develop something new would be fun if we can come up with the right thing and they're into it. But right now, I'm just trying to write. I'm trying to work on my own like writing, and I'm working with Andrew on he's got a fantasy series in development called Only Hope, which is pretty cool, and he's done a lot of writing for. And he's got a series artist lined up, and we're working on you know, getting some artists to do covers, and Comic Craft is whipping up a logo, and you know, so we're developing that series, which is his baby, and I'm just a sounding board for. And then I'm working on my own personal stuff right now.
That sounds great. Well, that's a good note to wrap up on. I wish you well.
Great, Boom. Thanks for taking the time, and I hope if people listen to this, that you know, the Once Upon a Time Machine Volume 2. It's all ages anthology of Greek myths and legends this time around, with a sci-fi twist, and out April 11th, I believe, in comic shops, and then I think the 24th in bookstores. The few remaining Barnes and Nobles that still exist in all those places.
Once Upon a Time Machine Volumes 1 and 2 are published by Dark Horse. Tell us what you think. Write us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com or contact us through social media. Find all the links on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. We're also on the Comics Podcast Network at comicspodcast.com and on comiccon.com, where our new episodes appear a few days before they show up anywhere else. Also, please give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, iHeartRadio, or wherever you find podcasts. We really need more listeners to give us reviews and help us stand out from the many comics podcasts that are out there. Our theme is from bensound.com. Once again, don't forget to help support the show with a pledge at patreon.com/deconcomics. Next Monday on Critiquing Comics, Mulela and I discuss 2 comics, LGBT characters in a Three Musketeers setting in A Light Before the Darkness by Ken Mora and Cyrus Mescarcia, and Japanese history in The Satsuma Rebellion by Sean Michael Wilson and Akiko Shimojima. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.